The little black girl hid beneath the lecture platforms, asking the biker why her mom never returned last night. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's gripping story. It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning, when the stillness of the schoolyard was broken by the frantic cries of a young girl. She ran through the crowd, tears streaking down her face, her heart pounding with fear. Her little hands grabbed the sleeve of a biker sitting by the stage, seeking safety in the chaos. "Please," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "Why hasn't my mom come home?" The biker, who had just finished helping set up for the school's charity event, looked up, startled. He could tell by the fear in her eyes that something was terribly wrong. The little girl's name was Aisha, and she couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. She was shaking, barely able to stand on her own as she clutched his jacket. His first instinct was to comfort her, but he could see the desperation in her gaze. Something told him this wasn't just a lost child asking for help. This was a cry for something much darker. "Where is your mom, little one?" the biker asked gently, kneeling down to her level. She hiccuped between sobs and pointed toward the street. She didn't come back last night." The biker's heart sank. He had seen enough of the world to recognize when a child was in danger, and the tremor in Aisha's voice told him that she had been through something far beyond her years. He stood up quickly, scanning the area, but the girl's words kept ringing in his ears. "My mom, she didn't come back." The biker turned to his friends nearby. They exchanged looks of concern. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and called the others. "We need to act fast. A little girl needs us." He wasn't sure what they were walking into, but he knew they couldn't ignore this. Not after the way the girl had looked at him, with the weight of 1,000 fears in her small, innocent eyes. Within minutes, his biker gang, known for their loyalty and commitment to their community, sprang into action. They knew that the world often turned a blind eye to people like Aisha, but not them. Not now. The bikers quickly mobilized, revving their engines as they got ready to head toward Aisha's home. The last thing they wanted was to waste any time. Aisha had no family that could protect her, and whoever had hurt her mom was still out there. As the sound of the engines roared to life, Aisha clung to the biker's arm, her face pale and streaked with tears. He patted her hand reassuringly, trying to calm her, even though he was just as shaken. They were about to embark on a journey that would take them deep into a situation they weren't fully prepared for. But they knew one thing for certain. No one, especially not a little girl, should ever feel abandoned. With the sound of their motorcycles echoing through the quiet street, they set off. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint orange glow across the horizon. But their mission had already begun, to find out why Aisha's mother hadn't returned home, and to make sure she would never feel that kind of fear again. The bikers roared down the highway, their engines thundering as they passed by the early morning traffic. The sky was still dark, but the promise of dawn was just beginning to paint the horizon. The air was thick with tension as the group of bikers sped towards Aisha's home. She sat in the front of the lead biker's motorcycle, gripping his jacket, her small frame trembling with fear. Her mind was racing, thinking of her mother and what might have happened to her. The biker, a large man named Jack, could feel her grip tightening on him, but he didn't dare ask her anything more. He knew that this wasn't just any normal situation. There was something deeper, something dangerous, and it wasn't just about the missing mother. As they approached the town where Aisha lived, Jack could feel the weight of his decision to help her. He had seen so much in his years on the road, but nothing quite like this. A child in distress with nowhere else to turn, no family to rely on. A promise had been made, and it had to be kept. They pulled up to a rundown house on the outskirts of town. The grass was overgrown, and the porch sagged in the middle, as if it had been abandoned for years. The house looked like it hadn't seen a proper repair in decades. Jack dismounted and helped Aisha off the bike. The rest of the bikers pulled up behind them, parking in formation. No one spoke. They all knew what was at stake. Jack's team spread out, scanning the area for any signs of trouble. Aisha looked up at the house with wide, fearful eyes. She was holding onto Jack's hand tightly, her voice barely a whisper. "This is where we live." The words stung in Jack's chest. It wasn't just a house, it was a prison. He could see the fear in her eyes, and it was enough to make anyone's blood boil. They walked to the front door, and Jack gently knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, this time louder. Still nothing. "Stay here," Jack said to Aisha, turning to the other bikers. "We'll check it out." One of the bikers, a woman named Vicky, stood by the door, keeping an eye on Aisha. She knew how to handle herself in these situations. Jack and another biker, Steve, pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, revealing the dark, musty interior of the house. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay and neglect. It was cold, much colder than it should have been for a house in the middle of summer. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they moved through the living room, which was filled with broken furniture and empty beer cans. There were no signs of a struggle, but the silence was deafening. Jack led the way down a narrow hallway, and as they passed a bedroom door, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A figure, slumped over, barely moving. "Call for backup," Jack said, his voice low. "I think we found her." Steve pulled out his phone and dialed for help while Jack stepped into the room. There, lying on the bed, was Aisha's mother. She was barely conscious, her body thin and frail, a shadow of the woman she used to be. She looked up at Jack with glassy eyes, her breathing shallow and labored. "She's been drugged," Jack muttered, kneeling beside the bed. "This isn't good." He looked at Steve, who had stepped back into the room. "We need to get her out of here, fast. We don't know who's behind this, but they've already done enough damage." Aisha's mother blinked slowly, trying to focus on Jack's face. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but the words never came. Jack could see the confusion in her eyes, and it was clear she wasn't fully aware of what was happening. He leaned closer, his voice steady. "You're safe now. We'll get you help, I promise." Aisha stood in the doorway, her small frame trembling. She had been watching from the hallway, waiting for someone to tell her what was going on. When she saw her mother lying in the bed, she gasped and ran forward, her little feet padding softly on the cold floor. Jack moved quickly to stop her, but Aisha was already at her mother's side. She reached out, gently touching her hand. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mom, please wake up." The room fell silent as everyone watched the scene unfold. The bikers knew there was more to this story than met the eye. There were unanswered questions, and they needed to get to the bottom of it. But right now, all they could do was keep Aisha safe and get her mother the help she so desperately needed. Jack turned to the rest of the group. "We need to take her to the hospital. There's no time to waste." With that, the bikers moved into action. They gathered Aisha's mother, carefully loading her into the back of one of the motorcycles, while Jack kept a close eye on the surroundings. There was no telling if the people responsible for this were nearby, but they had to move quickly. Aisha was holding onto Jack's arm as they made their way back to the bikes. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with worry, but there was something else in her gaze now, a glimmer of hope. As they rode off, the sun was rising higher in the sky, and for the first time that day, Aisha allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The ride to the hospital was fast, but it felt like the longest journey of Jack's life. The roar of the engines, the blur of the landscape, and the wind whipping through the air only heightened the tension in the group. Aisha clung tightly to the biker in front, her tiny hands gripping the jacket with desperation. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the road ahead, but her thoughts were elsewhere, torn between the fear for her mother and the hope that the bikers could save her. Jack kept his eyes on the road, trying to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept drifting back to the moment when he saw Aisha's mother lying in that dilapidated house. The woman had been barely conscious, a shell of the person she once was, her frail body testament to the years of neglect and abuse she had endured. What had happened to her? Why hadn't anyone stepped in sooner? Jack pushed the questions aside for now. The only thing that mattered was getting Aisha and her mother to safety. As they approached the hospital, Jack's heart started to race. The sound of the motorcycles faded into the background as his focus sharpened. The bikers pulled into the emergency entrance, engines roaring as they came to a halt. Jack jumped off his bike and rushed to the back, helping to lift Aisha's mother off the motorcycle. Aisha followed closely behind, her face still pale but showing a hint of relief. The hospital staff was already waiting for them, having received a heads-up from the bikers. Nurses and doctors quickly took over, ushering the group inside. Aisha's mother was wheeled into the emergency room, and Jack stood outside with Aisha, watching as the doors closed behind them. The weight of the situation was settling in. Aisha's face was full of worry, her small hands twisting together nervously. Jack crouched down to her level, giving her a reassuring smile. "She's in good hands now. They're going to take care of her," he said softly. Aisha nodded, but her eyes never left the door. She wanted to believe him, but the fear in her heart was too strong. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew her mom had been through something terrible. "What happens now?" she asked in a small voice. Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. The truth was, he didn't know what would happen next. The people behind this were still out there, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done with Aisha or her mother. He glanced over his shoulder, seeing the rest of the bikers standing by, their faces full of concern. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Now," Jack said, his voice steady. "We wait, and we make sure she's safe. But don't worry, we've got your back. No one's going to hurt you or your mom again." Aisha looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with trust. She had no reason to believe him, but for the first time that day, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. The bikers weren't just strangers who had shown up out of nowhere. They were here for a reason. They were family, and family didn't walk away. As they waited outside the emergency room, Jack could feel the tension in the air. The bikers were all on edge, unsure of what was coming next. Jack knew they needed to find out who was behind this, and they needed to do it fast. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call to a few of his contacts. "We need to know who her stepfather is, and who else might be involved in this," he said, his voice low. "I want everything. Every detail." He ended the call and turned to the group. "We can't just sit here. We need to find answers." The bikers nodded in agreement. They weren't used to waiting around. They were used to action, and action was what they would get. Meanwhile, inside the emergency room, doctors worked quickly to stabilize Aisha's mother. They hooked her up to IVs, checked her vitals, and ran a series of tests. Her condition was critical, but at least she was alive. Aisha stood by the door, watching through the small window, waiting for any sign of good news. As time passed, the anxiety started to build again. What if it was too late? What if her mother didn't make it? Just as Aisha was about to break down, a nurse came out to speak with her. She had a kind smile, but there was a serious look in her eyes. "Your mother is stable for now," the nurse said gently. "We're doing everything we can, but she's going to need a lot of rest and care." Aisha let out a sigh of relief. Her mother wasn't out of danger, but for now, she was safe. "Can I see her?" Aisha asked, her voice trembling. "Of course," the nurse said, "but you'll need to wait for just a moment. The doctor will be in soon to explain everything." Aisha nodded, her heart still heavy with worry. She was grateful for the bikers, for the strangers who had stepped in when no one else had. But she knew the fight wasn't over. They still had to find the people responsible for her mother's condition, and they would stop at nothing to get the answers. As she sat down in the waiting area, Jack came over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice firm. "Just hang in there." Aisha nodded, feeling a small measure of comfort in his words. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time that day, she allowed herself to believe that everything would be okay. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot. Jack sat on his bike, his eyes scanning the horizon. The rest of the bikers were gathered around him, their faces tense. They had been waiting for hours, but there was no news about Aisha's mother. She was still in critical condition, and no one could tell how long it would take for her to recover, or if she would even survive. The silence was heavy, but Jack could feel it in his bones. Something was wrong. He had been around long enough to know when trouble was brewing, and everything about this situation felt off. He looked at Aisha, who was sitting on a bench by the hospital entrance, her small hands folded in her lap. Her face was pale, but she wasn't crying anymore. She had cried enough for one day. Jack could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She had been through more than any child should ever have to experience. Her mother, who had always been her protector, was now the one who needed protection. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet, almost pleading expression. She had been asking about her mom every few minutes. but all they could do was give her vague reassurances. No one had the answers she needed. Jack stood up and walked over to her, his boots clicking softly on the pavement. He crouched down to her level and gave her a gentle smile, though his heart was heavy. "We'll figure this out, kid. Don't worry," he said, though he didn't fully believe his own words. Aisha nodded but didn't respond. She was too tired to speak. Jack ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. It wasn't just Aisha's mother they had to protect. There was something much darker at play here, something that had been building for years. He could feel it in the air, a tension that was slowly suffocating the town, and it was only a matter of time before it reached them. "We need answers," Jack muttered to himself. He glanced back at the bikers, who were still gathered in small groups, discussing what to do next. They were all waiting for the next move, and Jack knew they couldn't sit idle much longer. The people behind this, whoever they were, wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, and the bikers couldn't let that happen. He had made a promise to Tyrone, Aisha's father, to protect his little girl. Jack wouldn't let him down. He turned to the group and called them over. "All right, we need to figure out who is behind this. Aisha's mom didn't get this sick overnight, and I don't believe for a second this was just some random incident. We've got to track down the stepfather and find out what's really going on here." The bikers nodded in agreement, their faces hardening with resolve. They were used to dealing with danger, but this felt different. This wasn't just about taking down some bad guys. This was about protecting a family that had already been torn apart. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, a nurse came out of the hospital. She looked tired but relieved. "She's stable now," she said, her voice soft. "It was touch and go for a while, but she pulled through. She's going to need time to recover, but she's alive." Aisha stood up quickly, her face lighting up with hope. "Can I see her?" she asked, her voice trembling. The nurse smiled gently. "Not yet, sweetheart. She's resting, and we need to make sure. She's fully stable before anyone can visit. But I promise she'll be okay." Aisha's eyes glistened with tears, but she didn't say anything. Jack gave her a reassuring pat on the back before turning to the others. "All right, let's get moving. We've got work to do." The bikers mounted their bikes and revved their engines, ready to hit the road. But as they prepared to leave, Jack noticed a black car parked at the far end of the lot, its tinted windows reflecting the dim light. He felt a chill run down his spine. Something didn't feel right. Without saying a word, Jack motioned for the others to follow him. They quietly moved toward the car, keeping their distance, but their eyes were sharp. As they got closer, they saw a man standing near the vehicle, his back to them. He was tall and muscular, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit the surroundings. Jack's instincts kicked in. This wasn't just a random guy waiting for a ride. This was someone who knew exactly what was going on. "Who's that?" Vicky whispered, her voice low. Jack didn't answer right away. He was watching the man carefully, trying to gauge his next move. As the man turned around, Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was the stepfather. Aisha's stepfather. He had been following them, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But Jack wasn't about to let him get the upper hand. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Jack walked up to him, his steps slow but purposeful. The man didn't flinch when Jack approached, but there was something in his eyes, a coldness, a hardness, that made Jack's blood run cold. "What do you want?" Jack asked, his voice low and steady. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at Jack, sizing him up. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and clipped. "You don't know who you're messing with, do you?" Jack stood his ground, unfazed. "I know exactly who I'm messing with. And I'm not afraid of you." The man sneered, but before he could say anything else, Jack's phone rang. He pulled it out of his pocket and answered it without taking his eyes off the man. "Yeah," he said. "We've got trouble," the voice on the other end said. "They're making their move. We need backup. Now." Jack's grip tightened around the phone. "On my way," he said, before hanging up. He looked at the stepfather one last time. "This isn't over." Without another word, Jack turned and signaled for the others to follow. They had work to do, and this time, they weren't going to stop until they had the answers they were looking for. The bikers raced down the winding roads, their engines roaring as the dark night swallowed them whole. The cool night air whipped past, but the chill of unease hung in the atmosphere. Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Aisha's stepfather was still out there, And Jack knew that this wasn't just about protecting Aisha or her mother anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that threatened to tear apart the fragile peace they had fought so hard to build. The call had come through just moments ago, and Jack's mind raced as he processed the information. Someone was making their move. The group had split up into smaller teams, each taking a different route to track down Aisha's stepfather and his allies. They had learned that the man wasn't just a typical abusive spouse. He had connections, and those connections were dangerous. He was part of something much larger, a web of power and corruption that stretched far beyond this small town. As Jack's team reached the outskirts of the town, the familiar hum of their bikes felt strangely out of place in the dead of night. The roads were empty, too quiet for comfort. Jack signaled for the group to slow down as they approached an old warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. It was a rundown building, barely standing, but it had a certain ominous presence. They had tracked the stepfather here, and Jack was certain that they were close. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of dust and rust through the air. Jack's instincts were on high alert as he dismounted his bike. The group moved quickly and quietly, knowing that any noise could give them away. They crept toward the warehouse, staying in the shadows, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest. He had been in tight spots before, but something about this felt different. It wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was personal. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. As they neared the entrance, Jack heard a faint sound, footsteps. He signaled for the others to stop and crouched low, peering around the corner of the building. A man was standing by the warehouse door, his back to them. Jack could see the outline of a gun at his side, and he knew that things were about to get ugly. The man was one of the stepfather's associates. Jack could feel the tension building as they prepared to move in. This was it, the moment of truth. Jack held his breath, waiting for the perfect opportunity. With one swift motion, he and Vicky rushed forward, tackling the man to the ground before he could even react. The rest of the bikers followed suit, securing the area quickly. The man struggled beneath them, but he was no match for the strength of the bikers. Jack grabbed him by the collar, lifting him up so their faces were inches apart. "Where is he?" Jack demanded, his voice low and steady. The man spat at him, but Jack didn't flinch. "You're going to tell me everything, or I swear to God, you won't leave this place in one piece." The man's eyes flickered with fear, but he wasn't talking. Jack tightened his grip, growing impatient. Just as he was about to apply more pressure, another voice echoed from inside the warehouse. "Let him go." The voice was calm, cold even, and it sent a shiver down Jack's spine. He turned to see a figure emerge from the shadows. It was Aisha's stepfather. Jack's blood boiled as he recognized the man. He had been right. This wasn't just about family drama. This man was part of a much darker operation. Aisha's stepfather walked slowly toward them, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk in here and take me down?" he sneered. "You don't know who you're messing with." Jack took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the man's. "I know exactly who you are, and I'm not leaving until I get the answers I came for." The stepfather laughed darkly. "You think I'm going to tell you anything? You're nothing but a bunch of outlaws. No one cares about what happens to me." Jack's anger flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose control now. "You're wrong," Jack said through clenched teeth. "We care, and we're going to make sure you never hurt anyone again." A tense silence hung in the air, the only sound being the distant hum of the wind. The stepfather's smirk faltered, just for a moment, and Jack knew he had him. "What are you involved in?" Jack pressed. "Who else is part of this?" The stepfather hesitated, but Jack could see the conflict in his eyes. He was calculating, deciding whether to reveal the truth or stay silent. "You're wasting your time," the stepfather muttered. "You'll never get the information you need. You're just a small-time biker gang, trying to play hero." Jack stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. "I don't care what you think I am. I'm here for Aisha and her mom, and I'll tear this whole place apart if that's what it takes to get them out of this." The stepfather glared at him, but Jack could see the fear beginning to creep into his expression. "You're done," Jack said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He turned to the rest of the bikers. "Take him in. We need to get him to the authorities." The bikers moved swiftly, securing the stepfather and loading him onto one of the motorcycles. Jack turned to Aisha's mother's stepfather one last time before they left. "This is your last chance," Jack said coldly. Tell us what we need to know, or you'll spend the rest of your life behind bars. Your choice. As the bikers rode off into the night, they knew the battle wasn't over. But tonight, they had taken a step closer to justice. And for the first time in a long time, they felt like they were winning. The sun was setting as Jack and his team made their way to the local police station. The mission had shifted from rescue to investigation, and the intensity of the situation was mounting. Aisha's stepfather had been taken into custody, but Jack knew that just getting him off the streets wasn't enough. They needed answers, and fast. The bikers had done their part, but now it was up to the authorities to piece together the puzzle. As they arrived at the station, Jack's phone buzzed. It was a message from Vicky, one of the bikers who had been on the mission with him. Got a lead on the connections. Meet me at the old diner in 20. Jack read the message and turned to his team. We've got another lead, he said. Let's move. The group mounted their bikes and roared off, the engine's deep growl breaking the silence of the streets. The old diner was a favorite local hangout, a place where the old-timers sat to sip coffee and talk about the past. But tonight, it wasn't a peaceful refuge. Jack parked his bike outside, scanning the area. There were no signs of danger, but he didn't trust it. The town had been shaken to its core, and everyone knew that someone powerful was pulling the strings behind Aisha's stepfather. As Jack entered the diner, he saw Vicky sitting at a booth in the back. She looked up and gave him a nod, motioning for him to join her. What do you have? Jack asked, sliding into the booth across from her. Vicky's face was grim. I've been digging around, talking to a few people. This isn't just about Aisha's family. There's a bigger operation here, one that stretches all the way into the city. We're dealing with something much deeper than we thought. Jack leaned forward, his interest piqued. What kind of operation? Drugs, human trafficking, and illegal arms dealing. Vicky replied, her voice low. It's all connected to people who have been operating in the shadows for years. Your guy, Aisha's stepfather, he's just a small cog in the machine. There are bigger players involved, and they're not going to stop until they're exposed. Jack's mind raced. This was bigger than he had imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. How do we bring them down, he asked. Vicky paused for a moment, then slid a folder across the table. This is what I've got. Names, locations, and evidence. It's enough to take down the whole operation, but we need the right leverage. Jack took the folder and flipped through the pages. He saw a list of names, addresses, and even photos of people involved. His eyes narrowed as he studied the faces. Some of them were familiar, others were new. But one thing was clear. This was a criminal network with deep roots. We'll need backup, Jack said. This isn't something we can do alone. Vicky nodded. I've already made the call. We'll have reinforcements in place. Jack closed the folder and slid it back to her. Let's move on this. We can't wait any longer. As the group prepared to leave the diner, Jack's thoughts turned to Aisha. She was still at the hospital, waiting for any word on her mother's condition. He hadn't been able to see her yet, but he knew that would have to wait. The mission had become too important. They had to take down this operation, for Aisha, and for the countless others who had been hurt by it. As they made their way out of the diner, Jack's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from one of the bikers who had stayed behind at the hospital. Jack, we've got a situation. Aisha's stepfather's lawyer is here, and he's asking questions. He's not just any lawyer. This guy has connections. We need to move fast. Jack's heart sank. The lawyer's arrival could mean trouble, and the last thing they needed was someone with connections stirring up the situation. Get Aisha out of there, Jack said. We're on our way. The bikers revved their engines and headed back to the hospital, their focus sharp. As they neared the building, Jack's mind raced. What kind of lawyer was this? And what did he know? They couldn't afford to let the stepfather's legal team get any more power. This was their chance to act, to get ahead of the game. When they arrived at the hospital, they saw the lawyer standing outside, talking to a nurse. He was dressed sharply, his suit expensive-looking, his demeanor cool and collected. But there was something in his eyes, an arrogance, a sense of entitlement, that made Jack's blood boil. He didn't care how rich or powerful this man was. He wasn't about to let him interfere in what was now a fight for justice. The bikers got off their bikes, and Jack walked straight toward the lawyer. You're not welcome here, Jack said, his voice calm but firm. The lawyer turned, his face a mask of surprise. And who are you? He asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Jack didn't hesitate. I'm the guy who's going to make sure you and your clients don't get away with this. Stay out of our way. The lawyer scoffed. You think you can intimidate me? I have connections that you can't even imagine. You're just a bunch of bikers. Jack took a step closer, his face hardening. You don't know who you're dealing with. We're not just bikers. We're people who protect those who can't protect themselves. And you're about to find out how far we'll go. The lawyer sneered, but Jack could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew this wasn't over, but Jack wasn't about to back down. This fight wasn't just about Aisha's mother anymore. It was about stopping a criminal network that had hurt too many people. It was time to finish what they had started. The tension in the air was palpable as Jack and the rest of the bikers made their way back to the warehouse. The encounter with the lawyer had only escalated the situation, and now Jack knew the stakes were even higher than before. They couldn't let up now. Aisha's safety, her mother's recovery, and the larger operation they had uncovered, everything was on the line. As they approached the warehouse, the dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows across the empty parking lot. The group dismounted their bikes, their boots hitting the ground with purpose. Jack felt a wave of urgency wash over him. He had to protect Aisha, had to make sure they took down the operation that had been running right under their noses. This wasn't just about saving one family anymore. This was about stopping a criminal empire that had hurt so many people. They moved swiftly, their eyes scanning the surroundings, looking for any sign of movement. The warehouse loomed ahead, silent and imposing. Jack could hear the low hum of the city in the distance. But here, in the shadows, everything felt still, as if time had frozen. They approached the door cautiously, with Jack leading the way. He signaled for the others to wait as he reached for the door handle. The metal was cold beneath his fingers as he twisted it, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. The dim light from the street lamp outside barely illuminated the large, empty space. The scent of oil and dust filled the air, and the silence was broken only by the faint sound of footsteps inside. Jack's instincts flared. He didn't want to rush in blindly, but he knew they couldn't wait much longer. He turned to the bikers, his voice low but firm. We go in fast. Stick to the plan. Don't let anyone escape. They nodded in unison, their faces hard with determination. Jack pushed. The door opened wide, and they filed in, moving quietly but with purpose. The interior of the warehouse was cluttered with old crates, metal parts, and abandoned machinery. It was the perfect hiding spot for someone trying to stay out of sight. But Jack wasn't about to let them hide. They moved deeper into the warehouse, their eyes adjusting to the darkness. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant noise made them all tense, ready for anything. Jack led them toward the back of the warehouse, where they had tracked down the operations hidden room. The walls here were lined with shelves, filled with boxes marked with symbols Jack didn't recognize. There was no mistaking it now. This was the heart of the operation. They had found the stash. But just as Jack was about to move forward, he froze. A voice echoed from the shadows. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was cold, calm, and eerily familiar. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figure emerging from the darkness. It was the stepfather. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, another figure stepped forward, a man in a black suit, his face shadowed. Jack's blood ran cold. I should have known you were involved, Jack said, his voice low with anger. The stepfather gave him a cold, mocking smile. You've been playing catch-up, haven't you? He sneered. You think you're going to stop us? Jack took a step forward, his fists clenching. I'm not here to talk. I'm here to finish what we started. The man in the black suit chuckled, the sound hollow. You're too late. You have no idea what you're up against. Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The sense of danger was thick, and he knew they couldn't take this lightly. He motioned for the bikers to spread out, covering every possible escape route. We'll see about that, Jack said, his voice unwavering. Without warning, the man in the suit stepped forward, a gleam of metal flashing in his hand. A gun. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he lunged forward, knocking the gun from the man's hand before it could be aimed. The group erupted into action, and the warehouse quickly became a battleground. The stepfather and his associates fought back, but the bikers were quicker, more experienced. They had fought battles before, and they knew how to move with precision. Jack and Vicky moved in tandem, disarming the men and taking control of the situation. The air was thick with the sounds of struggle, but Jack was focused only on one thing: stopping this operation. He couldn't let them hurt anyone else. As the last of the men were subdued, Jack turned to the stepfather. "You've lost," Jack said, his voice hard. The stepfather scowled but said nothing. He had no fight left in him. Jack motioned for the bikers to secure the area, ensuring no one could escape. They had won this round, but the war was far from over. Jack pulled out his phone and dialed the authorities. "We've got them. The operation is shut down," he said as he spoke to the dispatcher. "Send backup. We need everything cleaned up, now." With the authorities on their way, Jack took a deep breath and glanced around the warehouse. The operation had been dismantled, but the truth was, it was just the beginning. There were still people out there who needed to be brought to justice. He turned to Vicky, who had a small smile on her face. "We did it," she said. Jack nodded, but his mind was already racing. This fight wasn't over, and he wasn't going to rest until every last person involved was held accountable. As the police arrived to take control of the scene, Jack and the bikers knew that they had made a difference. Aisha's mother would recover, and Aisha would finally have the chance to live a life free from fear. But Jack also knew that in a world like this, the fight for justice was never truly finished. As the dust settled around the warehouse, the sound of approaching sirens grew louder. The authorities were on their way, and Jack felt a sense of relief, but it was fleeting. He knew the battle was far from over. This was only one small victory in a much larger war. The bikers had done their part, and now the law would take over. But as Jack stood among the wreckage of the operation, the faces of Aisha and her mother lingered in his mind. They were the reason they had fought so hard. They were the reason they had put everything on the line. Jack looked around at his team, their faces grim but proud. They had done what they set out to do. They had taken down the criminals who had been terrorizing the community for so long. They had made sure that Aisha and her mother would never have to live in fear again. Vicky walked over to him, her boots crunching on the broken glass and debris. She nodded at the scene, her expression hard but satisfied. "We did it," she said, her voice low. Jack nodded, but his thoughts were still elsewhere. "It's not over," he muttered. Vicky raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jack's gaze moved toward the horizon, where the first rays of the morning sun were breaking through the clouds. "There's still more to uncover. We've shut down one operation, but there are others out there. And we still don't know who's really pulling the strings." Vicky looked thoughtful for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. This was just one piece of the puzzle." Jack turned to the group, gathering their attention. "Listen up, everyone. The cops will be here soon to take care of the rest. We've done our job, but the fight's not over. We've still got work to do. We can't stop until everyone involved in this is held accountable." The bikers nodded in agreement. They knew the stakes were high. They had taken down a major operation, but there was always more lurking in the shadows. "We'll keep digging," Jack continued. "We'll find out who's behind all of this, and we'll make sure they face justice." The group dispersed, getting ready to leave the warehouse as the police arrived. Jack stayed behind for a moment, his mind racing with the next steps. There were still questions left unanswered, and he wasn't about to rest until he had the answers. As the bikers rode off, Jack's thoughts returned to Aisha and her mother. The fight they had fought was for them, but it was also for everyone else who had been wronged by the people who thought they could get away with it. They had made a difference, but there was still more to do. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He had promised Aisha's father, Tyrone, that he would protect his family, and he was determined to keep that promise. No matter what it took. The ride home was quieter than usual, the sound of the bikes cutting through the morning fog. Jack's mind wasn't on the road, though. His thoughts were still with Aisha and her mother. They had been through so much, and now, finally, they could begin to heal. Aisha's mother was stable, and her condition was improving, but Jack knew that it would take time. The emotional scars would take longer to heal than the physical ones. Aisha, too, would need time to process everything that had happened. But Jack felt a sense of pride in knowing that they had given them that time. As the bikers pulled into the parking lot of their base, Jack took one last look at the road behind them. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt a sense of hope. They had done something good. And sometimes, that's all it took to make a difference. Aisha's stepfather would face justice, and those responsible for the operation would be brought down. Jack knew there would always be more to fight for, more people to protect, but for now, they had won. Jack walked into the clubhouse, where the rest of the bikers were already celebrating. He nodded to Vicky, who was sitting with a few of the others, talking about the next steps. Jack didn't feel like celebrating. Not yet. He needed time to reflect. He walked over to the bar, poured himself a drink, and sat down by the window. Outside, the sun was fully risen now, casting a warm glow over the landscape. It was a new day, a day where Aisha and her mother could begin to rebuild their lives. And for the first time in a long time, Jack allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. As the sound of laughter filled the clubhouse, Jack smiled quietly to himself. There was still work to do, but they had made a real difference today, and that was something to hold on to. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment, but also a gnawing sense of unfinished business. The bikers had done what they set out to do, but Jack knew that the fight was far from over. The operation they had taken down was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. As he sat in the clubhouse, Jack reflected on everything they had gone through. The danger, the uncertainty, and the fear that had gripped them all. But through it all, they had kept going, and they had made a real difference. Aisha's mother was recovering, slowly but surely, and Aisha was adjusting to the idea that she might finally have a chance at a normal life. For the first time in a long time, Jack allowed himself to believe that everything might actually turn out okay. Still, the memory of the stepfather and his lawyer haunted him. They had been powerful figures, connected to an operation much bigger than anyone had realized. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there were more people out there, more forces pulling strings in the shadows. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He stood up, walking over to answer it. Vicky was standing on the other side, a serious expression on her face. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. Jack stepped aside, allowing her to enter. "What's going on?" he asked, already sensing the urgency in her tone. "It's about the stepfather," Vicky said. "We've got some new information. It seems like he's not just a low-level player in the operation. He's been involved with some pretty high-ranking individuals. We're talking about people who have connections in places we don't want to mess with." Jack's stomach tightened. He had known something was off about that man, but hearing this confirmed his suspicions. "What do you mean? Who are these people?" "We're still digging," Vicky replied. "But it looks like we're dealing with some powerful figures in the criminal underworld. People who have the resources to make this whole thing disappear if they want to. If we don't move fast, we could lose everything." Jack's mind raced. This was the last thing they needed. They had already risked so much, and now they were facing an even bigger threat than before. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. "We need to find out everything we can about these people," Vicky said. "We can't take them down without knowing exactly who we're up against. But we have to be careful. These people don't play by the same rules." Jack nodded. "All right, let's get to work. We're not backing down now." Vicky gave him a tight smile, and Jack could see the determination in her eyes. They had come this far, and they weren't going to stop until the job was done. The bikers rallied together once again, the urgency of the new threat clear in their eyes. They knew they couldn't afford to waste time. The criminals they were up against were dangerous, but they weren't backing down. They had come too far, and they had something even more important driving them now: justice. As they split up to gather more information, Jack's mind returned to Aisha. He hadn't seen her much in the last few days. She had been staying with her mother at the hospital, but Jack knew it was only a matter of time before they would have to face the next challenge. The deeper they went into this, the more dangerous it became. But he couldn't let that stop him. He had made a promise to Tyrone, Aisha's father, and he would honor it. Aisha would be safe. Jack just had to make sure of it. As the team regrouped later that day, they shared what they had learned. There were whispers of corruption within the local government, ties to powerful cartels, and people who had the means to make anyone disappear without a trace. The scope of what they were dealing with was overwhelming, but Jack refused to let fear take hold. "We've got to keep moving," Jack said, his voice calm but determined. "We can't let them intimidate us. We'll take them down, one step at a time." The bikers nodded, each of them committed to the cause. They weren't just fighting for Aisha's family anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had been silenced by fear. As the sun set on another long day, the bikers prepared for what lay ahead. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were ready. They had already faced down some of the darkest corners of the criminal world, and they weren't going to stop now. The fight for justice had only just begun, but for the first time in a long time, Jack felt confident that they could win. They had each other, and together, they were unstoppable. The tension was higher than ever as the bikers prepared for the next phase of their mission. Jack sat on his bike, deep in thought, his hands gripping the handlebars tightly. The air felt thick, as though the storm that had been brewing for weeks was finally going to break. The news about the criminal operation they had been hunting was more complicated than they had anticipated, and Jack knew that if they didn't act fast, the consequences could be disastrous. Vicky walked up to him, her face set in determination. "We've got a lead," she said, her voice low. "It's bigger than we thought. These people are connected to a whole network. We need to hit them where it hurts." Jack looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What are we looking at?" Vicky handed him a folder with several documents inside. As Jack flipped through the papers, he saw the names and faces of people who had been untouchable for years. Law enforcement had been corrupted, the politicians they trusted were compromised, and the criminals they had already taken down were only small players in a much larger game. "This is it," Jack said after a long pause, his voice firm. "This is what we've been after." The biker crew gathered around as Jack explained the plan. "We're going to hit them where they think they're untouchable. We know who's in charge, and we know where they're hiding. It's time to end this." The group nodded, their faces determined. Each one knew what was at stake. They had been fighting for Aisha, for her mother, and for everyone else who had suffered at the hands of these criminals. But now, it wasn't just about one family. It was about taking down an entire network. "We move fast and hit hard," Jack continued. "There's no time to waste. These people are dangerous, and they'll do anything to keep their empire running." The bikers readied themselves, adjusting their gear and checking their bikes. As the group mounted their motorcycles and revved their engines, Jack's heart raced. He knew they were walking into a dangerous situation, but they had no other choice. The time for waiting was over. They had to act now. The convoy of bikes roared through the streets, the engines echoing off the buildings as they made their way toward the abandoned warehouse where the operations leaders were rumored to be hiding. As they neared the location, Jack's mind raced. This wasn't just another fight for survival. This was the culmination of everything they had been through. They had faced down corrupt officials, dangerous criminals, and obstacles that seemed impossible to overcome. But now, they were about to take on the heart of the operation itself. They reached the warehouse, the massive building looming before them in the fading light of the afternoon. Jack signaled for the group to stop, and they dismounted, their boots hitting the ground with purpose. They had a job to do, and they weren't leaving until it was done. The bikers spread out, moving quickly and quietly as they approached the entrance. Jack led the way, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. They had to move fast. This was a strike, not a standoff. As they approached the warehouse, the faint sounds of voices and footsteps inside confirmed their suspicions. The criminals were there. Jack motioned for the group to get into position, and they took their places, ready for the attack. Jack's heart was pounding, but he kept his focus. They couldn't afford to hesitate. He stepped forward, kicking the door open with a swift motion, and the bikers rushed inside. The room was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. Jack's eyes immediately landed on the men in the center of the room, high-ranking members of the criminal network. The fight that followed was swift and brutal. The bikers fought with everything they had, their experience in combat making them a force to be reckoned with. The criminals, caught off guard, didn't stand a chance. Jack and Vicky moved together, disarming men and taking control of the situation with precision. It didn't take long for the criminals to realize they were outmatched. One by one, they were taken down. Jack's focus never wavered. He had seen too much to let these people get away with their crimes. As the last of the criminals were subdued, Jack stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the leader of the operation, the man who had orchestrated everything. He was lying on the ground, his face bruised and battered, but his eyes were defiant. "You think you've won?" The man spat, blood dripping from his lips. "This is bigger than you. You can't stop it." Jack crouched down, his voice steady. "You're finished. This ends now." The man sneered, but there was fear in his eyes. Jack wasn't fooled. The man knew it was over. The bikers moved quickly, securing the area and calling the authorities. They couldn't afford to waste any time. This was their chance to bring down the entire operation. As the police arrived, Jack stood back, watching as the criminals were loaded into the cars. The job wasn't done yet, but they had taken down the heart of the operation. Jack turned to the bikers, his face grim. "This isn't over. We've won today, but there are more of them out there. We have to keep going." The bikers nodded in agreement, their resolve as strong as ever. They had fought hard, but the fight was far from over. As Jack looked around at the faces of his crew, he knew one thing for sure. Together, they were unstoppable. They had taken on the worst, and they had won. Now, they were going to make sure that no one else would have to suffer the way Aisha and her mother had. Jack's heart was heavy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his mission lift. They had made a real difference, and for now, that was enough. The aftermath of the raid was a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The bikers had done what they set out to do, taking down a dangerous criminal operation that had run unchecked for too long. But even as Jack stood outside the warehouse, watching the authorities process the criminals and load them into squad cars, he knew that this was only one chapter in a much larger story. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered, and Jack was certain that they had only scratched the surface. As the last of the police cars left the scene, Jack turned to his team. Vicky was standing beside him, her eyes scanning the area, but her expression was unreadable. "What's next?" she asked. Jack glanced at her, feeling the weight of the question. "We keep digging. The people we've taken down today are just the beginning. There's a whole network out there, and we need to find it all." Vicky nodded. "You're right. But we've made a dent, and that's something." Jack didn't respond immediately. His mind was already racing, thinking of the next steps. "The hardest part is yet to come," he said finally, his voice low. "We've got to deal with the higher-ups, the ones behind all of this. We've exposed the first layer, but there's so much more." The group gathered around, each one aware of the risks involved. Jack wasn't worried about the danger. They had been through worse. But the complexity of what they were facing now was something different. These criminals had influence, money, and connections that spanned far beyond this small town. "We need to figure out who's pulling the strings," Jack continued. "We need to find their weaknesses and take them down from the inside." As they stood there, making plans, Jack's phone buzzed. He pulled it out of his pocket, scanning the message that had just come through. It was from one of his contacts in law enforcement. "We've got a lead on the people who helped fund the operation," the message read. "It's big, Jack. You need to see this." Jack's pulse quickened. "This is it," he muttered to himself. He turned to Vicky. "Get the team ready. We've got a lead." They didn't waste any time. The bikers quickly mounted their bikes, and Jack led the way, their engines roaring as they hit the road once again. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the landscape. But Jack didn't have time to appreciate the view. His mind was focused solely on the mission ahead. As they neared their destination, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. This wasn't just about stopping a few criminals. It was about taking down an entire system of corruption that had been thriving in the shadows for years. They pulled into a small, unmarked building on the outskirts of town. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the place looked abandoned. But Jack knew better. This was where the operation had been funded, and the people behind it were likely watching their every move. Jack signaled for the bikers to be quiet as they dismounted. They spread out, moving toward the back entrance of the building, staying in the shadows. Every step felt like it could be their last. But Jack knew they had no choice. They had to press forward. The door was locked, but it was nothing the bikers couldn't handle. Vicky quickly picked the lock, and they slipped inside, moving through the dark, empty halls. The building was eerily quiet, but Jack could feel the tension building. Something was about to happen, and he wasn't sure if they were ready for it. As they reached the back office, Jack motioned for the group to stop. He crept forward, peering through the small crack in the door. What he saw inside confirmed his worst fears. Several men were sitting around a table, their faces hidden in the shadows, but Jack could tell they were in charge. These were the people who had been pulling the strings. Jack's hand tightened around the handle of his gun, but he knew they couldn't rush in. They needed to be smart. The bikers were good at what they did, but this was different. These were the people who had been funding the operation, and they weren't going to go down easily. He turned to Vicky. "We need to move in fast, but we need to stay controlled," he whispered. "We can't let them escape." Vicky nodded, signaling for the others to take their positions. They moved in perfect coordination, surrounding the room, waiting for the right moment. As Jack slowly pushed open the door, the men inside looked up, surprised but not panicked. They had known something was coming, but they hadn't expected the bikers to be this close. "You're finished," Jack said, his voice cold. The men didn't speak at first, but their eyes narrowed. They knew this was the end of the line for them. Jack took a step forward. You thought you could hide behind your money and your power, but it's over. We're bringing you down, no matter what. The men exchanged glances, and Jack saw the flicker of fear in their eyes. These were powerful people, but they were also trapped. Jack and the bikers had them cornered. Get on the ground, Jack commanded. One by one, the men complied, the fear and realization settling in. They were no longer in control. The bikers had taken down their empire. As the police arrived to take over, Jack turned to Vicky. This is it. We've done it. Vicky smiled, but there was no triumph in her eyes. It's over for them, she said. Jack nodded, his face grim. But we've got more work to do. The fight's never truly over. As they walked out of the building, the sun had fully set, and the bikers rode off into the night. They had done what they set out to do, but Jack knew the road ahead was still long. The fight for justice was never really finished, but they had taken down one of the biggest threats they had ever faced. And for now, that was enough. The sun had barely risen when Jack and his team gathered at the edge of the town. The atmosphere was still heavy from the previous events, but there was a sense of finality in the air. They had taken down the core of the criminal operation, but Jack knew the job wasn't completely finished. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there were still some lingering questions. As he stood next to his bike, looking out over the quiet town, Jack felt a strange mix of relief and restlessness. He had promised Aisha's father, Tyrone, that he would protect his family, and now he could see that promise coming to fruition. Aisha was safe, her mother was recovering, and the criminals who had harmed them were being brought to justice. But in the back of his mind, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The network they had just uncovered was far-reaching, and the people involved were powerful. There was no way they could be completely finished, not until every last person was held accountable. Vicky approached him, her steps quiet but purposeful. She stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "What's going on in that head of yours?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Jack didn't turn to face her, but his expression softened slightly. "I don't know. I just feel like there's still more to be done," he said, his voice laced with uncertainty. "We've taken down a lot, but these guys were just one link in a much bigger chain. And I'm not sure we've taken out the head of the snake." Vicky nodded, understanding the weight of Jack's words. "I feel the same way. But what else can we do? We've exposed them, we've brought down the people in charge, and now it's up to the law to handle the rest." Jack turned to her, his eyes serious. "I know, but that's not enough. We've seen how deep this goes. We've seen how far they're willing to go to protect themselves. The law might get them, but there are still people out there who will keep coming after us, after Aisha, after anyone they think is a threat." Vicky didn't say anything at first. She simply watched him, letting his words sink in. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady. "So what are you thinking?" Jack paused for a moment, then made his decision. "We take the fight to them," he said, his voice resolute. "We don't wait for them to make the next move. We track down every last one of them and make sure they're held accountable. No more games." Vicky gave a small, approving nod. "All right, let's do it." The rest of the bikers gathered around as Jack outlined their next steps. They would need to work quickly, following every lead they could find, hitting them hard and fast before anyone had the chance to regroup. The team was ready, their faces hard with determination. This wasn't just about protecting one family anymore. This was about making sure no one else ever had to suffer like Aisha and her mother. Jack's plan was simple: take down every person involved and leave no room for them to escape. They weren't going to wait for the authorities to clean up the mess. They were going to finish what they started on their own terms. The day was still young when they hit the road again, their bikes cutting through the streets with a new sense of purpose. Jack led the way, his mind focused on the task ahead. Each twist of the throttle brought them closer to their goal. As they rode, Jack's thoughts turned to Aisha, her innocent face still fresh in his mind. They had done this for her mother, and for every other person who had ever been harmed by these criminals. This fight was personal now. As they reached their next destination, a seemingly innocuous warehouse on the outskirts of town, Jack felt the familiar rush of adrenaline course through him. This was it. They had found another key player in the operation, and it was time to take him down. The group moved in silently, their bikes parked out of sight, their movements synchronized. The warehouse loomed before them, its windows dark, its doors sealed. But Jack knew better than to underestimate these people. They weren't just hiding. They were waiting for someone to make a mistake. They wouldn't give up without a fight. Jack signaled for the group to spread out, each biker taking a different position around the building. They needed to be careful. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. Jack and Vicky made their way to the side door, where they found a locked gate. Jack didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open with a single powerful motion, and they slipped inside, moving quickly and quietly. Inside, the warehouse was eerily silent, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. They crept forward, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust on the floor. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. In the back of the warehouse, hidden behind crates and boxes, they found a group of men gathered around a table. They were speaking in hushed tones, but as Jack and Vicky approached, the conversation stopped. The men looked up, eyes widening as they recognized the bikers. It was clear these men weren't prepared for a fight, but they wouldn't go down without resistance. Jack and Vicky didn't waste any time. The bikers moved in fast, disarming the men and taking control of the situation. As the last of the criminals were subdued, Jack took a deep breath, his heart racing. They had done it again. The group quickly secured the area, ensuring no one could escape. Jack turned to Vicky, his face grim but satisfied. "One step closer," he muttered. "But we're not done yet." They made sure all the criminals were taken into custody and handed over to the authorities. As the bikers stood in the now silent warehouse, they knew they had accomplished something important. But they also knew the fight wasn't over. The network they had uncovered was far-reaching, and there was still work to be done. Jack glanced at his team. "We're not stopping until every last one of them is held accountable." The bikers nodded, their resolve stronger than ever. They had come a long way, but the war was far from over. For now, they had made a difference, and that was enough. The final day of their mission had come, but the weight of everything they had endured still pressed heavily on Jack's shoulders. As the bikers gathered outside the abandoned warehouse, he looked around at his team, each one battered, tired, but resolute. They had taken down the entire operation. The criminal network they had been hunting for so long was dismantled. The faces of the criminals were familiar now, each one marked by the consequences of their actions. But as Jack stood there, watching the authorities take the last of the criminals into custody, he knew they weren't the only ones who had paid the price. Aisha and her mother had been through too much. Jack could still see Aisha's frightened face when they first met her, how small she had seemed, how desperate for someone to help. The memory of her clinging to him, her eyes full of fear, was something he would never forget. But she was safe now. Aisha's mother was recovering, and with the criminals behind bars, they could finally start to rebuild their lives. Jack turned to Vicky, who stood by his side, her gaze focused on the scene unfolding before them. "We did it," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. Jack nodded, his eyes distant. "Yeah, we did. But it's not just about this victory. It's about everything we've done for people like Aisha. We made sure she's got a chance now." Vicky gave him a small smile. "We made sure she's not alone." Jack looked at the rest of the crew, each biker lost in their own thoughts. They had all played their part in this, each one bringing their skills, their strength, and their loyalty to the fight. But now, with the dust settling, Jack felt a sense of finality. The battle was over. The war was won. "What's next?" Vicky asked, breaking the silence. Jack looked over at her, the weight of the question heavy. "We rest for now. We've earned it." The bikers spent the next few days tying up loose ends, making sure the criminals wouldn't escape, and ensuring Aisha and her mother had everything they needed to start their lives anew. The town, once scarred by the operation that had plagued it for so long, now had a chance to heal. The authorities worked tirelessly to keep the criminal empire from rebuilding itself, using the evidence the bikers had uncovered. Jack knew this was just the beginning for the town, but he also knew that the people there would be better for it. As the team packed up their things and prepared to leave, Jack stood outside the clubhouse, taking in the view of the town. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace. The bikes were all lined up, ready to hit the road again. But this time, Jack felt no rush. They had completed their mission. Aisha's life had changed. Her mother's recovery was underway. The fight for justice had been won. And for the first time in a long time, Jack allowed himself to feel a sense of closure. They had done what they set out to do. But even as he stood there, Jack knew one thing for sure. The fight never truly ended. The world was full of darkness, and people like him, people who fought for others when no one else would always be needed. The road would always call. As the bikers revved their engines and hit the open road once more, Jack felt a new sense of purpose. There would always be new battles, new people who needed protection, but for now, they had earned their peace. For now, they could rest, knowing that they had made a difference. Aisha and her mother would be safe. They would have a future. And Jack had kept his promise. The ride into the horizon felt different now. It wasn't about the adrenaline, the chase, or the danger. It was about something much more. It was about the people they had fought for. It was about the hope they had given to those who had none. As the wind rushed past and the bikes roared down the road, Jack allowed himself to smile. They had won. And for now, that was enough. In this intense and thrilling story, the Hell Angels face their toughest battle, yet as they take down a dangerous criminal network operating in their town. As they fight to protect a young girl and her mother from the ruthless criminals who have terrorized them, the Hell Angels uncover a web of corruption, danger, and violence that reaches far beyond what they initially imagined. With each victory, they draw closer to exposing the truth, but they also realize that the real fight is just beginning. Hell Angels stories like this one showcase their relentless pursuit of justice, no matter the personal cost. Through the challenges, the Hell Angels show what it means to stand up for the vulnerable, never backing down from the dangers that threaten those they care about. The story unfolds with gripping action, high-stakes confrontations, and powerful moments of redemption. The Hell Angels prove time and time again that they are more than just a motorcycle club. They are warriors for justice, always ready to face whatever comes next. As the story builds to a dramatic conclusion, it leaves us questioning just how far these brave men and women will go to bring about real change. This is not just another tale of outlaw bikers, but a journey through courage, sacrifice, and the power of standing up for what is right, making it a captivating example of Hell Angel stories. The stakes have never been higher, and the Hell Angels will stop at nothing to protect those who need it most. With the help of their grit and determination, they emerge victorious, but it's clear that the fight for justice will never truly be over. Hell Angel stories remind us that heroes come in many forms, and sometimes they ride motorcycles into the unknown, fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves.